does nothing, or generally doesn't help a situation. How false that seems when we look at the life of General James Doolittle, a Medal of Honor recipient, and the man who led the daring raid to attack Japan using medium bombers that took off from an aircraft carrier, something that had never been done before, or even thought of. It is that attack that I would like to focus on today. But first, a little bit of background. First of all, Doolittle was part of the group with Mitchell during the bombing of the Ostfriesland. This means that he had seen the effect air power could have on navies, and he realized that air power is the future. After Mitchell had been court-martialed, he left for the Air Force Reserves, and he went on to become part of the Shell Oil Company. In 1941, after December 7th, he went into the military forces, and it was during that time he became a lieutenant colonel, and he decided that the year was 1942. The war in the Pacific was not going too well for the United States. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December the previous year, and the loss of the Philippines around the same time had really hurt American morale. President Franklin Roosevelt needed something to help support the American people. And so he went to Hap Arnold and asked him, what can we do? Hap Arnold went to Doolittle, at that time he was part of his staff, and asked Doolittle to plan something that could be done. Doolittle helped come up with a plan to use a group of medium bombers taking off from a carrier to strike at the Japanese capital of Tokyo. His plan was controversial because up to that point, nobody had even thought of having bombers take off from a carrier. Many said it couldn't be done. Doolittle selected the B-25 Mitchell bomber for the task ahead because it could do this. It could take off. He found out that it could take off from 450 feet, and it had the proper wing loading for that short takeoff, and it could carry the amount of bombs they needed for the range they needed. Initial plans called for 24 bombers to be used, but only 16 bombers were used in the strike. The mission was strictly voluntary. Every single crew member volunteered for the mission without even knowing what they were volunteering for. Most of the training was done at the Lexington County Army Air Base in Columbia, South Carolina. One of the first problems that Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle ran into was the bomber itself. The B-25 Mitchell bomber was a two-engine bomber designed to take off from a normal field, certainly not one of the aircraft carriers of that time. In fact, the USS Hornet, the carrier used for the task, was only 824 feet long, and the typical takeoff range for a B-25 was at far greater distances, or so the Army initially thought. Doolittle proved that the bomber could take off in just 450 feet with a strong headwind. With this in mind, the project was still feasible. The next problem was the range. Because they were attacking Japan from a carrier, they needed a place where they could head next. Since although the bomber could take off at those distances, it still could not land in that short of a distance. China, because of the fact it was fighting Japan at the time, was decided upon as the place to head after the strike. Initial testing began in February of 1942. The mission parameters were for an airplane that could travel 2,400 miles carrying a 2,000-pound bomb load. The USS Hornet was the carrier that was utilized for the raid. Built in 1940, she and her sister ships, the Yorktown and the Enterprise, were the key fleet vessels in the Pacific War, since most of the battleships had been destroyed a few months earlier at Pearl Harbor. At the time of the raid, the ship was captained by Mark Mitcher. The ship made speed towards the Japanese coast so that the bombers could be as close as possible before the attack was launched. It was decided that the Hornet and her 7 ships of her fleet would meet up with Admiral Halsey's fleet to create Task Force 16, and they would bring the B-25s as close as possible to Japan. The Japanese were aware of their movements, but due to radio silence from 1,000 miles out, they did not know where they were or if they were even heading towards Japan, so they decided not to worry about it. Unfortunately, the United States did not know that the Japanese had a fleet of picket ships stationed 650 miles out, where they spotted the ships. The fleet saw one of the ships and destroyed it, but they decided to launch early, not knowing if they had been spotted or not. The B-25s quickly took off, with Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle's plane leading the way, and the last of the 16 bombers taking off an hour after him. Each plane, other than the one commanded by Doolittle, carried 3 500-pound bombs and 1 500-pound incendiary bomb. However, Doolittle's plane had 4 500-pound incendiary bombs because he was going to mark the targets for the others. The plan had initially called for a night raid on Tokyo, so the incendiaries would allow the others to see where to put their own bombs. The raid came over Tokyo at about around noon, and the bombers attacked their targets in the factory area of Tokyo. The raid was immortalized in the book 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, because that was approximately the time they had over Tokyo before they were heading out. Very few of the bombers were attacked by the Japanese fighters because the Japanese thought it was a training exercise of their own planes. One of the bombers was attacked and was forced to drop the bombs in the bay, but the rest of the ships escaped safely. On the way to China, many of the ships were forced down for lack of fuel because they had to leave so much earlier than they had planned. Doolittle, being one of the lucky ones, bailed out into a rice paddy and was soon rescued by Chinese peasants. Some of the other pilots would not be so lucky, however, some even dying or drowning. Out of the 16 aircraft Doolittle used for the raid, not one was usable after the crash landing in China. One was forced to land in Russia, where they were interned by the Russians until they managed to escape. One of the planes was shot down in Japan. Of the crew from that plane, 4 prisoners were executed after a mock court trial that the Japanese had. 4 were held prisoners and returned home after the war. 3 were injured. The damage to the Japanese was minimal at best, slightly damaging the carrier Ryushu that they had in dry dock, and destroying a few small insignificant buildings. However, the damage to Japanese morale was key, because they were bombed by medium bombers, not long-range bombers, but medium bombers. That psychological warfare was something that outweighed all the costs. The attack also boosted the United States morale as well. When Lieutenant Colonel Doolittle crashed into China, he felt that his mission had been a failure. But when he returned to the U.S. to a hero's welcome and realized how much it had affected the United States morale, he realized that the bombing damage was not the only thing that mattered. Doolittle received the Medal of Honor for his courage and bravery in the raid. This raid showed how significant air power was as an offensive weapon, especially for psychological warfare. Doolittle was promoted to Brigadier General and went on to command the 15th, 12th, and 8th Air Forces during the war. He became the only reserve officer to attain the rank of Lieutenant General, and after the war he returned back to Shell Oil as the Director and Vice President. In 1985, Congress voted to change his rank on the Air Force retired list to General, a full 4-star rank. This made him the first person and only person in Air Force Reserve history to wear 4 stars. Any questions?
Bravo.